Our next presentation is by Rear Admiral Nigel Greenwood of the Royal Canadian Navy, and his topic is making E-commanders out of E-navigators. I'm not supposed to give any biographical information about the speakers, so I won't, but if I did, I would say I was quite impressed by your resume, sir. So. Please welcome Rear Admiral Greenwood.
This is on?
You can.
Yeah, that one may work.
Wait, you have to press it here.
Good. Okay, we're good to go? Not too close to the mouth, right. Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for Sam for providing this opportunity to speak about a passion for nautical training, and also providing the introduction to my colleagues from Sea Drive, who I've been in conversation with over a year without meeting them before yesterday. I should explain where I come from. I'm a naval officer who achieved a Master Mariner's ticket during my career, but my experience is all in the naval domain. I grew up on the British Columbia coast, navigating in much the same way as Captain Vancouver did 200 years earlier in the same kind of vessels, basically bathymetry by keel depth. And then I graduated to more modern systems in the Canadian Navy, by which I mean Decca, Omega, Loran, Charlie. So the whole aspect of e-navigation is relatively new to me. I should caveat my speech by saying that I'm not here as a representative of the Navy, being retired for a year and a half now, but I come with the experience of the Navy and a passion for nautical training that started during my own time coming up through the ranks, being captain of a ship and trying to mentor junior officers in both navigation and command qualification. And I should say that my own course to high rank was not an unmitigated success, and so I think that's a necessary part of the whole learning experience too, and I can speak more to that. One of the advantages of coming late in the program here is you get to benefit from everything that's being said before, and not to repeat that. I assure you that I haven't doctored my slides with all that I've learned in the last day and a half, but I assure you that I have learned quite a lot about e-navigation. It's been reassuring to hear some of the phrases that I've used in my own brief repeated, and I should say that there's a healthy dynamic and tension in the discussion that ranges between traditional methods and modern methods, and the skepticism that underlies all change. The title that I was given to start this brief was E-navigators from traditional navigators. And really, that's not the paradigm that we have to deal with in the Navy, nor in the Coast Guard, and to a certain extent here at Cal Maritime, I would guess. We all more or less start with a fresh slate. We have young, unformed minds, and it's for us to do what we want with them. In fact, the Navy has this whole saying that we're not looking for bright lads, we're looking for half-wits. The Navy will provide the other half in its own way, in its own time. And so what I'm going to show you here is the way that the Canadian Navy does that now, and I don't take any particular ownership for it, but I want to present it as kind of answering the challenge that Steve threw out there about competence-based training, because that's definitely what we do in the Canadian Navy, and we do it in an environment that is increasingly electronic and sophisticated and uses all of those available tools that have been talked about over the last day and a half. Here's some quotes that I pulled out of the references that I reviewed before I came down here. And the things that I want to point out here is the kind of consistency with what's been said so far. The top quote there dating from 2007, and the bolded is my bolding just to lend emphasis to the points that I think are important. And I'll draw your attention to very ancient and sacred principle of navigation, cross-check, and the data integrity of the primary system against the secondary as a matter of routine navigational practice. And we've talked quite a bit about that in the last day and a half, that kind of skepticism of how reliable it is, and what sort of cues do you use to reassure yourself that the virtual reality actually does correspond with the reality that's either going to keep you off the mud or not. Research indicates that around 60% of all collisions and groundings are caused by direct human error, and it's pointed out there that the majority of watchkeeping officers make critical decisions for navigation and collision avoidance in isolation. And that may be due to reduction in manning, but more commonly, I would say it's due to the fact that you have a single officer of the watch, perhaps with a helmsman, perhaps with a lot more people at his beck and call on a naval ship, either to his detriment or his advantage. But the principle is that the guy on the plates has to make a decision for better or worse many times under time pressure, and he doesn't have time to consult external agencies, nor necessarily to get the captain out of his rack. And so the captain has to be assured that the training, experience, and background of that officer is sufficient to the challenges that may be presented to him in a way that he has to solve personally and immediately. E-navigation requiring a new level of sophistication and the requirement to transition gradually. Well, hasn't it always been that way? At every level and stage of the development of navigation, there have been new things to assimilate and to work into your practice, whether it was chronometers at sea, whether it was resolving star sights by Sumner's method and Mark St. Hilaire's method, radars, all the rest of that. So what we're talking about in terms of the challenges of integrating e-navigation is not necessarily a new thing. E-navigators, well, what are they? I guess there's a common perception out there, the smart young lads here, nicely turned out in a pristine bridge environment. And what are their counterparts, the traditional navigators? Well, these two old guys. And I have to say that I resemble these guys because the Canadian Navy employs a system of senior retired naval officers with command experience to be mentors in our simulator. And many of them do look, in fact, like that. But the difference between these guys is not necessarily what you'd think, okay? It's not just that these guys are conservative and fixed in their ideas and resistant to change, and that these guys embrace change, but these guys have wisdom and experience, and so we're not necessarily trying to turn the traditional navigators into e-navigators, but we're trying to get the e-navigators who can use all this bright new equipment to gain the experience and the judgment that will make them safe traditional navigators and safe captains when they get to that rank and when they've lost most of their hair. And perhaps this is the end state of the transformation, except nowadays the captain's not the only black box on board. We have many more to supplement him. And I'll talk a little bit more about the decisions and wild guesses as we go forward here. So here's how we do it in the Canadian Navy. Technology is involved from the very beginning. The young officers are exposed to this kind of part-task trainer. They're all issued with a laptop that has many of the similar programs and kind of work practices and the exercises to run through on their own time. They're exposed to the bridge simulator, which is Kongsberg setup. We actually have 7 separate bridges that can run on the same database concurrently, or they can run separately. Many of them have kind of 220 to 330 degrees visibility on plasma panels, and one is a 360-degree projection system. The MARS program, Training for Maritime Surface and Subsurface Officers, takes about 1 year and 200 training days, and I haven't listed the classroom here, but what I'm drawing attention to is how much time they spend in the simulator and how much time they actually spend at sea. And the sea time is spent exclusively in these vessels, the Orca Vessels, of which I have some pictures to follow here. And we work progressively through kind of general understanding of what watchkeeping responsibilities are through more progressively challenging exercises leading up to charge of these vessels at sea in the final phases. And at each stage here, in the simulator and in the sea time, there are competence-based evaluations to pass that particular phase. When they finish that, they go to their operational ship for 18 months or so. They'll gain sea time according to what the ship's actual program is, and at the end of it, they'll have to set a competency board, an oral exam that leads them to the equivalent of a third mate's ticket. And these are what the Orca vessels look like. We have 8 of them. That's enough to very robustly threaten the shipping on the west coast of British Columbia. They're fully modernized bridges with redundant navigation systems, so the principal officer of the watch can be navigating the ship, and then his backup can be watching it and manipulating the system on a separate standalone system. Nice ships, they're about 200 tons. They'll do 22 knots at high speed, and that's a bit of a problem because they throw up a massive wake. This is one of the more interesting exercises that we do both in the simulator and for real at sea. It's called Officer of the Watch Maneuvers, and I'll just draw your attention to the title there. For the Americans in the room, just desserts for the torturing that I got as an exchange officer. This is the correct spelling of maneuvers. So what we do is we do round-the-clock maneuvers at 500 yards, going from cardinal to intercardinal positions, opening and closing on the beam and ahead and the bow and quarters between 500 and 1,000 yards. And so the young officers get to do this. They have to learn the solutions. They have to do the mental math of determining whether they're ahead or astern of station, and they get a really good intuitive sense of what kind of maneuvers develop relative movement changes in the guide, which is the one with the flag. So we'll do that at sea with these 5 vessels or more, and they also do, and they're evaluated on that. The one thing I would point out that in my day, we used to do this at similar distances in frigate-sized vessels. And so if you can imagine the fright factors of going from the beam to the stern at 500 yards in a frigate-sized ship, you'll understand why the captains always seem to treat the students as terrorists. So transformation, it continues in the Navy, and this is a particular challenge that we have in the Navy in developing people to the rank of captain. We don't have a long time to develop the navigational competence and skills and experience on the bridge. They pass through that phase very, very quickly. They go into the ops room, they become weapons specialists and all the rest, and then we have to bring them back to command. And we do this through a command development course of 10 weeks. What's really pertinent to this audience, I think, in the e-navigation premise is that many of our failures are not for command skills per se, but it's in the ship handling and navigation. And so a lot of our effort goes into refreshing ship handling, seamanship, refreshing them on the technology of the equipments on board, and then working through decisional problems of knowledge, how that's applied, case studies of when things go wrong, and decision-making practices. So we deal with this kind of stuff. What are the causes of accidents? What are the causes of poor decisions? And it could be any number of these. Lack of information. Well, not always the principal problem. It's how you deal with that information. And that's why, to answer the problem of e-navigation, I don't think, or I don't believe, that more information is necessarily the right thing. It's how it's presented, how does it lend an assistance to the decision-making process. We teach them a decision-making process, and some of you know about an OODA loop where you observe, orient, decide, and act, and then you repeat the circle. And the idea in a military sense is to get inside the decision loop of your adversary. Well, other shipping is not necessarily adversarial in that sense, although it may sometimes seem like that. But the point is to develop in the young officer an idea of a deliberate decision-making process so that they can then rapidize that and use it in a more intuitive way to arrive at the decisions that they need under pressure. But here's the paradox. In many cases and in experience of studies, it's not really a deliberate and analytical process. A lot of it is about recognition, and so the challenge becomes not necessarily how do you teach people to recognize and then formally resolve a situation, but how do you get them the necessary experience so they recognize both the problem and the solution almost intuitively and immediately. And there's many approaches to this. More info, but in the end, how much is really required? Synthesizing experience. I think this is an important one, and our speaker at lunch yesterday talked about drilling emergencies when everything's going well. That's important, and we saw this recently in one of our destroyer captains came up and very rigorously exercised a tow that he was going to do with a tanker. And he thought he had it wired, But then when he actually went to sea and did it, it went badly wrong, and he ended up critically damaging his ship, which is still out of commission. And I think what he had failed to do is to really get close enough so that the fright factor would kick in, or he'd see what it looks like just before the collision. Automation. For the naval officers and Coast Guard officers, they may recognize this: threat evaluation and weapons assignment. That's an acronym for a specific purpose in a military context, but it has to do with automated response where it parses the priority, it's programmed to decide and act all automatically. Not necessarily what you want in resolving a rule of the road situation, but the point of the matter is, even in automated systems, you have to put a lot of effort into configuring them and managing the system if you're going to get the right result. External direction. This kind of answers the question about VTS direction. How omniscient can the shore authorities be in offering that direction and offering useful decision advice? And better presentation. I think for ENAV, this is really the way to go, is how do you get that key information that becomes intuitive and leads to that correct decision? And here's the problem. The cleaner and more perfect you make the presentation, the more believable it is. And if you believe it for certain, it may still not quite be so. And I'm going to show you here a couple screenshots of our ECDIS system. Now, these are not the screenshots that I would have preferred to show you. I wanted to show you the screenshot that led to a grounding. And unfortunately, it can't be released from the Board of Inquiry in the public domain yet. But the point of the fact is, it was a similar sort of presentation under more constrained circumstances with multiple inputs, but with rather limited inputs. And that's something pertinent to the Navy as well, is frequently we're operating in a degraded system where you don't have all of your systems available, either deliberately for tactical reasons or because of degraded situations or what have you. So you might not have visibility on the beach, certainly not if you're a submarine. You might not have radar because you want to be covert. And in this case here, lots of information, clearing bearings, a track line, a fix up here, an EP, and all the way down to there. And that looks like a pretty good anchorage, you know, very, very close to the intended mark. And yet, when you put the radar image overlay on top of it, you realize that something's wrong. Now, this is important also for e-navigation, and it spells the difference between traditional navigation and e-navigation. And I'm not convinced, notwithstanding all the technology we use in the Canadian Navy, that we've truly got beyond traditional navigation. And the reason I say that is because we're still focused on fixing and using the system to do much of what we did on paper. It's just presented in electronic form. It's basically a plan view of the ship and the track and where you intend to be and where you have been. And you can layer the radar over it, as we are here, to see that there's a difference in position, and the actual position of the ship is here, not here. But we're not really getting beyond the traditional at this point. Now, I think that's a statement of the obvious, perhaps, but it still begs the question is, how far do you want to get beyond the traditional? Because as I pointed out earlier, the tradition is skepticism about your inputs, a consistently critical mind about why you're operating and how you're operating the ship. So here's what I call the E-problem. And I won't go through all of these in detail, except to say that, you know, there's a statement of the pro and the possible cons. Highly precise data, decreasing skepticism of reliability. Magnitude of menus to know and navigate, it's complex. Instantaneous position information, this is interesting, and I've seen this in our simulator, is that when you get kind of that instantaneous update of the ship's position, there's kind of an instinct to drive intuitively as if it's a virtual reality game, and they'll try to do this even though they don't have the experience to know exactly what the turning rate is going to be. So they're not using the whole system to plan it deliberately. And we'll have to move on here because we're almost there. So the E-problem graphically. Well, this was always the problem, wasn't it? How many of you traditional navigators here got beat up for having your head stuck in the chart table? or having your head stuck in the radar hood or whatever. And, you know, it's just a machine, another machine to get your head stuck into. And the challenge is how to get people to look out. And someone else mentioned this too, ENAV-assisted collisions. Well, I think that's a handy corrective to the overwhelming belief in the infallibility, in the reliability of electronic systems. I'm not going to go through this because it's been covered adequately, but this is the challenge. How best to aid the awareness and decision-making process. And here's an eye test for you, something just to think about. What I want to point out here, and this is really, it's an incomplete product of just a thought piece to highlight where the decision and the action takes place. So there's stuff over here that can all be dealt with by e-navigation, but it's kind of the stuff that happens, you know, some of it has to be dealt with by the Office of the Watch, but it's not the immediate stuff, and it's not the stuff that should interrupt his focus on the anti-collision situation. But here's the line that we need to follow, is the safety line. Anti-collision navigation, weather, heads-up displays, bridge and captain's cabin. Somehow an alarm is generated to the Office of the Watch, who either relays it to the captain and engages him in the decision process to arrive at a course of action, or the logical extension of e-navigation is actually using e-navigation to make the decisions or recommend the decision aids. And this here, tactical decision aids, well, the Navy's been waiting for this forever. In some ways we have it and it's pretty good. In other ways it has never realized the continued promise of technology for the last 30 years of my career. But here's where it gets interesting. There's the TWA that deals with certain things. It's programmed to deal with really kind of set predictable problems, to prioritize them and then to engage them one after the other in order. Here's the other way to go, artificial intelligence that is a more sophisticated approach and can address more complex problems. But how well it does that is dependent on how well you can kind of program that artificial knowledge and experience and foresee certain situations in order to arrive at an action. The real problem, I think, is where one of these, or even this here, presents a solution that is either not really what's required by this guy who has to execute it immediately because of the time pressure, or some of these things acted in a way that the captain doesn't have an opportunity to intervene. So I think that kind of covers from the training of trying to use all of the available technology to synthesize experience and to particularly in the Canadian Navy, because of that kind of fleeting window of bridge experience, is to pack as much experience as possible in there, whether it's virtual in a simulator, whether it's good sea experience, and then to really deal with the challenges of command when people come back to get that qualification. And with that, I'll finish and await your questions at the panel discussion. Thank you.